So in our last screencast, we looked at just sort of some vocabulary for anatomy and physiology. As I said, this is not something you can just listen to me talk about. You got to practice it, work with it. So I'm just going to show you a couple review slides. I really encourage you to pause and try these out and see how you do. This first one just looks at, do you know the names of the different terms? So hit pause, try it out, and I'll go through the answers really quickly. A is superior, B is proximal, C is anterior, D is medial, E is distal, F is inferior, G is posterior, and H is lateral. So hopefully you have those down. Here's a little bit more advanced set of problems. See if you can figure out which term describes the location of each of these. So I'll do one with you. The nose relative to the ear. So if I start at my ear and I go towards my nose, what direction is that? So again, I'm going to let you hit pause and try these out, and then I'll go through the answers. Did you do it? Did you hit pause? Who knows? I don't know. Only you know. But here are the answers. So the wrist relative to the elbow is distal. I know I got to figure these out myself now. Oh, actually, I have the answers. Here's the answers right there. So you can go ahead and check those answers, and then I don't have to worry about messing it up. Okay, so the last section of this introductory unit is on the integumentary system. The integumentary system refers to your hair, your skin, and your nails. And so let's take a look at what that is. First of all, is skin considered a tissue or an organ? Any thoughts? Turns out it's an organ. And the reason it's an organ is because it consists of many types of tissues working together. So for example, you can see blood in here. There's arteries and veins in skin. So blood is a type of connective tissue. There's adipose tissue, fat, right here. There's nervous tissue somewhere, there it is, in there, because you can feel when somebody pricks your skin with a pin or something. There's there's epithelial tissue covering the skin. So there's lots of different tissues working together. So we call it an organ. Not only that, it's actually the largest organ in the entire body. So this is actually from an exhibit. It's called Body Worlds, where they do fancy dissections that's sort of part art, part science, and they illustrate unique things about the human body. So basically, they kind of went all Game of Thrones on this guy and removed his skin, and that's what it would look like removed. So if you skinned an adult, you'd have a 4 by 5 foot area rug that weighs about 10 pounds. So fun fact, the thickness would vary. Your eyelids are your thinnest area of your skin at 0.5 millimeter, and the sole of your foot is the thickest at 1.5 millimeters. So maybe just go to Target and buy an area rug. It's probably easier. So here are the different layers of skin. 3 layers: epidermis, dermis, and then what's called the hypodermis down below. So the epidermis is your outer layer of skin. And as you might expect, the epidermis does replace itself. And true or false? Replace itself once a year. What do you think? What do you think? Turns out it's false. It's actually once every 28 days. So basically every month, that outer layer of skin totally replaces itself. How does that work? Well, at the base of the epidermis, you'll see that dermis, that middle layer I briefly mentioned, is here. So the epidermis starts at this point on the diagram, and everything above it is epidermis. But down below, you see this layer of cells, and this one may trigger some memories from biology. That is a cell doing cell division. It's doing mitosis, metaphase, if you really want to be impressive. So these cells are dividing, and as they divide, they push out on this outer layer of cells. These cells start producing a protein called keratin, and the keratin sort of becomes more and more prevalent in the cell until eventually the cell literally becomes so clogged with keratin that it dies. And so once it dies, it kind of shrivels up, and these outer layers of skin are outer layer of cells are basically just dead cells filled with keratin. And that's actually a good thing because, as you're bumping and, into things and banging into things, you lose that outer layer. And so by having it be just this dead layer of cells, what you lose are these dead cells, and that's fine. Interesting fun fact, guess where those dead cells end up? They're a common component of dust. So when you're like writing your name in the coffee table dust layer, you're actually writing your name in the dead skin cells of people who've been in your house, your family and friends. Isn't that kind of a fun little thought? And if that is really gross to you, don't worry. It's not just dead skin cells. There's also, insects and spider eggs and some good old fashioned just dirt blown in from outside. So there's other stuff in that dust too. Anyway, um, there's a couple proteins that I think are worth mentioning in the epidermis. The first is that keratin that I already mentioned. The keratin is a protein that limits water loss. It's actually it's actually keratin that gives reptilian skin that kind of scaly feeling that it has. And keratin, interestingly, was a protein that first evolved in reptiles. So if you think of amphibians, frogs and toads and salamanders, they have that slimy skin. They don't have keratin. And as a result, frogs and toads and salamanders have to stay near water at all times. That's why you only see frogs and toads and salamanders in ponds and stuff. And those that have managed to live in the desert basically spend their lives underground where there's some tiny bit of moisture still left for them. Keratin, though, allows reptiles to move off into drier habitats because it limits water loss and keeps it in. That's a good thing for us because it means we also can wander away from water and spend time away from it without drying up and getting all shrivelly. If not for this, we'd have to get back to the water. Every class period would end and we'd be like, okay, get back in the water. We could have maybe a lazy river that we could just kind of float between classes. I think that'd be awesome. Another protein in your epidermis is melanin. Melanin is a pigment that gives skin its color and also protects us from UV light. So, people obviously have very different skin colors, and that skin color biologically is the result of how much melanin is in that skin. So someone with very dark skin has a lot of melanin. Someone with very light skin has relatively little melanin. Notice, by the way, that we're talking how much of this one particular protein is in the outermost layer of skin. It's not even skin deep. It's just the outer. It's like epidermis deep. That's how biologically insignificant this is. And so, what a tragedy that skin color has played such a prominent role and caused so much pain and misery and suffering. It really is biologically pretty insignificant. So it might make you wonder, though, why do these different skin colors exist? Where'd they come from? You're welcome to watch this little video clip. It's a very good summary of what's going on, but I'll give you the gist. Skin is different colors because of two different constraints. If there is too much sun exposure, if you are exposed to too much sun, that can be harmful. As we've already seen, it can cause wrinkles, but more importantly, it can cause sunburn, and that can even cause skin cancer, which is obviously bad. It can also, perhaps more importantly, damage something called folate. Folate is a vitamin that's really important for fetal development, and if pregnant women don't get enough folate, their newborns are at risk of spina bifida, where the spinal cord, you can see, is actually outside of the body. That is, I can't even imagine what that would be like, but this is a really big deal, very problematic. And so obviously too much sun exposure, bad. Too little sun exposure is also bad because it can lead to a vitamin D deficiency. And vitamin D is produced it uses sunlight to produce, your body uses sunlight to produce vitamin D. If you don't have enough vitamin D, it can actually interfere with bone development. So Ricketts disease is this condition where your bones sort of bow outwards. You see how these are bowing outward? And basically, because of insufficiency in vitamin D, the bones are not as strong as they should be. They get these little microscopic fractures, and then they kind of heal in this curvy, weird pattern. So too little sun exposure is bad. It can also lead to seasonal affective disorder, which has the appropriate acronym SAD. Fun fact, here in Minnesota, a lot of people suffer from seasonal affective disorder because winters have so little sunlight in them. I have a couple friends who are therapists, and they tell me business is booming in the winter months, and then they have much less business in the summer. And so that's kind of a sad little reality of living in Minnesota. Vitamin D definitely affects your mood. So too much sun bad, too little sun bad. Well, if we look at a map of the globe, what we find is that sun exposure is different in different parts of the world. So here near the equator, that is where the sun exposure is most intense. And so people whose ancestors evolved near the equator had more sun exposure. So the risk at this point was too much sun exposure. And so these people evolved to have darker skin, more and more melanin, to protect against that UV light sun exposure. As people migrated northward, well, there's less and less sun exposure the further north you go, as we've seen with our Minnesota winters. And so people in Northern Europe have evolved to have much lighter skin. Now the risk is too little sun exposure and vitamin D deficiency. So people evolve less and less melanin so that they get as much sunlight as possible to ensure proper vitamin D production. So basically that is why skin color is the way it is. Now you might say, well, what about like South America? Why don't they have as dark a skin as people in Africa? The answer, rainforest. The rainforest is there, which creates a lot of natural shade versus Africa, where it's largely open field, savanna kind of areas. Australia is also pretty wide open, so we see that darker skin there. So there's little variations due to just the habitat, but for the most part, this is why skin color has evolved the way it has. And again, that's it. Biologically, it's very insignificant. So there you go. Don't be a racist. All right. So other melanin tidbits, freckles are just these little local clusters of melanin. That's all they are. And some people, their freckles become more prominent in the summer when there's more sun exposure. And then you actually can produce more melanin in response to your environment. So if you tan, either through a tanning bed or by laying out in the sun, you're going to produce more melanin. But again, remember, the more you do that, the more damage you're causing to that loose connective tissue that holds your skin onto your underlying muscle, and then you get more wrinkles later on in life. And so, tanning, whether it's in a tanning bed or out in the sun, either way puts you at risk of wrinkles and skin cancer. So you got to be careful with that. So there you go. That brings us to the dermis, and I think I will pause at this point and we'll pick this up with part 2.